The soft glow of candlelight illuminated the elegant interior of Lenoble, a restaurant known for its exclusivity and refined clientele. Patrons whispered in hushed voices, their laughter soft and polite, as the staff glided between tables with flawless grace. The hum of classical music played in the background, adding to the sophisticated ambiance. Stephen Curry, dressed in a simple yet well-fitted casual outfit, stepped inside. The buzz of conversation seemed to pause, the air thick with the silent acknowledgement of his presence. As he walked in, some customers recognized him immediately, others curious but uncertain of his identity. Sofia Ramirez, a seasoned server with sharp eyes, glanced up from her duties. She quickly assessed him, noting his attire, a far cry from the tailored suits of the usual guests. Her internal judgment kicked in, and she steeled herself to handle what she assumed would be an uncomfortable situation. "Good evening," Sophia greeted him with a polite but detached smile. "Right this way, sir." Stephen followed her, his demeanor calm and unbothered. Despite the tension building within Sophia, he remained unfazed. The golden light of the setting sun bathed Lenoble's dining room in a soft, warm glow. The restaurant, renowned for its understated elegance, was a haven for the city's wealthiest and most discerning clientele. Expensive art adorned the walls, and crystal chandeliers cast delicate reflections onto the polished floors. The atmosphere was hushed, but filled with an unspoken sense of privilege, the hum of conversations barely audible over the muted strains of classical music. Sophia led Stephen Curry through the room, her heels tapping sharply against the floor, each step a rhythmic punctuation of her professional poise. She passed tables where patrons dressed in sleek, tailored suits and elegant evening gowns dined with an air of importance. She could almost taste the cool detachment in the air as the staff moved in practiced synchrony, attending to the rich and powerful with impeccable service. To be seen here was to be part of a world few could enter, a world Stephen had yet to prove he belonged to. As she guided him to a table near the window, the view framed perfectly by the towering glass, she couldn't help but notice the dissonance between his appearance and the usual crowd. His attire was casual, jeans and a fitted jacket that seemed comfortable, not designed to impress. Sophia's practiced eye caught the way he carried himself, calm and unassuming. He seemed oblivious to the opulence surrounding him, or perhaps just indifferent. Sophia adjusted her uniform and placed the napkin in her hand as she set it down in front of him with a smooth motion. She kept her voice even, polite, but there was an edge to it as she extended the wine list. "Would you care to start with something to drink, Mr. Curry?" she asked, her smile just a touch too rehearsed. "We offer quite an exquisite selection of wines from our cellar. I'm sure you'd appreciate our finest." She emphasized the words, "our finest," letting the suggestion hang in the air like a delicate trap. She was sure he wouldn't understand. After all, he was a basketball player, not someone accustomed to the complexities of fine dining. Stephen met her gaze with a small, easy smile. His demeanor was unbothered by her subtle condescension, though he caught the hint in her voice. He didn't seem to care much for the formality of the situation, nor did he care for her attempt to impress him with the restaurant's offerings. "I'll go with a water for now, thanks," he said, his voice as calm as ever, the smile still soft on his lips. Sophia's hand froze slightly, a flicker of surprise crossing her features. She had anticipated a different reaction, perhaps a feigned interest in the selection of rare wines or a quick nod to the most expensive bottle on the list. Instead, he chose water, of all things. The simplicity of the request unsettled her for reasons she couldn't quite pinpoint. She quickly recovered, though, and nodded. "Of course, water it is," she replied, turning to walk away. But as she moved, her thoughts swirled around her, solidifying into an opinion she hadn't even realized she had formed. This man, who could be sitting in the most exclusive private dining rooms in the world, was choosing water as if he didn't know or care about the culinary world she was so immersed in. Her gaze lingered on him briefly, studying his posture, the way he rested one hand casually on the table as he glanced out at the cityscape. His calm presence contrasted sharply with the rush of the evening, the other guests dining with forced grandeur. She couldn't help but wonder, what kind of man chooses water in a place like this? Was he really so ignorant of the lifestyle she'd come to know, or was there something more deliberate in his choice? Either way, she was certain of one thing. He didn't belong here, at least not in the way that these people did. As she turned away, she could feel her opinion of him solidifying. To Sophia, the act of dining was an art, a performance of elegance and sophistication. And yet, this man was not performing. He was simply existing in the space, unbothered, unfazed. The more she observed, the more his presence seemed to contradict everything that Lenoble stood for. He wasn't here to impress anyone, to follow the rules, or to bow to the expectations of the elite. That in itself was a bit unsettling. Sophia's mind began to spin. Who was this man? Was he a celebrity slumming it for the evening, trying to appear as though he wasn't wrapped in the privilege of his fame? Or was he truly indifferent to the show that she so carefully curated for her guests? Either way, Stephen Curry wasn't playing by the rules, and that made him stand out in a way that was both intriguing and frustrating. She shook her head slightly, forcing herself to focus on the tasks at hand. But the nagging thought stayed with her. Perhaps, just perhaps, there was something more to this man than his jeans and his water. The evening moved on, but Sophia couldn't help but feel that Stephen Curry had already begun to challenge her assumptions in ways she wasn't yet ready to face. As the evening deepened and the rich aromas of gourmet dishes mingled with the soft clink of glasses and silverware, Sophia's initial discomfort with Stephen's presence only intensified. The air in Lenoble grew denser with unspoken judgments, and she could feel them pressing in from every corner of the room. She watched him still sitting at his table with an ease that contradicted his casual clothes, a simple black t-shirt, faded jeans, and a pair of sneakers that seemed entirely out of place among the starched collars and tailored suits of the other patrons. Despite her growing discomfort, she couldn't deny that Stephen carried himself with an effortless grace, savoring his meal with the precision of someone who'd experienced fine dining before. His manners were impeccable, his fork held delicately as he cut into his steak, pausing now and then to take a thoughtful sip of water. The sharp contrast between his presence and his attire gnawed at her. How could someone like him belong here? Sophia's internal battle raged on, but she pushed the thought away as she approached his table to take his dessert order. She had been trained to remain professional, to mask any discomfort she felt with a polished smile and well-rehearsed words. But tonight, the invisible tension between them was too much for her to bear. Standing at the edge of his table, she cleared her throat, preparing herself for what she was about to say. It wasn't a comment she would normally make, but something about him, the calmness, the lack of concern for how others might perceive him, drove her to speak out. "Not that it's any of my business," she began, her voice a touch sharper than she intended, a subtle air of superiority creeping into her tone. She caught herself too late, but the words had already escaped. "But I must say, you don't look like the usual type of guest we get here." Stephen paused mid-bite, his fork hovering in the air for a fraction of a second as he processed her words. For a moment, the room seemed to fall away, as if the conversation between them was the only thing left in existence. He set his fork down slowly, his eyes meeting hers with a calmness that immediately put her on edge. His gaze was steady, patient, not defensive or confrontational, but quietly assertive, as if he was willing to let her speak her piece, if only to test her own assumptions. "And what type is that?" Stephen asked, his voice low but gentle, with a curiosity that was almost inviting. His words didn't hold any malice, just a quiet invitation to reconsider the judgment she had already passed. Sophia's heart skipped a beat, caught between the instinct to explain herself and the realization that he had already seen through her. She felt a brief surge of unease, the kind that only comes when you realize you've miscalculated, but she pushed it down, forcing a thin smile in an attempt to cover her discomfort. "I mean," she continued, her words coming out more guarded now, as if trying to maintain control over the situation, "I just don't see many people in casual clothes in here, especially not, people from sports." Her attempt to play it off as a harmless observation fell flat in the stillness that followed. She immediately regretted it, wishing she could swallow her words back into her mouth. The silence hung between them, thick and uncomfortable, until she finally looked away, unable to meet his eyes any longer. But Stephen didn't respond with indignation or anger. Instead, he leaned back slightly in his chair, his expression softening. He seemed unbothered, almost amused by the irony of the situation. His lips parted, and his voice, still calm and measured, broke the tension with a single, quietly profound statement. "Appearances can be deceiving." The words weren't confrontational, but they hit her with the weight of unspoken understanding. They weren't just a comment on her judgment, they were a gentle challenge, a reminder that she had reduced him to a simple stereotype, based solely on his clothing, his profession, and the narrow lens through which she had been viewing him. Sophia blinked, taken aback. She wasn't used to being confronted so directly, especially not with such quiet wisdom. She didn't fully understand the depth of his words. But there was something about them that made her pause, made her reconsider her assumptions. She raised an eyebrow involuntarily, a small sign of both confusion and the dawning realization that she might have made a mistake. "What do you mean by that?" she asked, almost defensively, though there was no malice in her tone, only the hint of curiosity that was beginning to replace her initial judgment. She had been so certain, so sure of the gap between them. And yet, here he was, disarming her with nothing more than a few simple words. Stephen didn't rush to explain. Instead, he allowed the moment to linger, to settle around her like a slow-moving fog. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes now studying her more intently, though still with that unshakable calm. "I mean," he said softly, almost matter-of-factly, "that how someone looks, what they wear, even where they come from, it doesn't tell you anything about who they truly are." His words were so simple, but they carried a quiet power with them. Sophia's mind began to spin, the realization that she had let something as superficial as his appearance dictate her opinion, settling heavily in her chest. She had based her judgment on assumptions that hadn't even been hers to make. "You can't judge a book by its cover," Stephen continued, his voice unwavering. "And sometimes, the most unexpected people can surprise you the most." Sophia's initial response, the snide, judgmental remark, had revealed more about her own insecurities than it did about Stephen. The truth of his words settled like an unwelcome truth, challenging the foundation of her own worldview. As Stephen returned to his meal, the tension between them began to dissipate, but the weight of his words remained, gnawing at Sophia's conscience. She had assumed, without reason, without understanding. She had let the surface-level facts color her entire perception of him, and now she was left with a sense of uncomfortable reflection. For the first time in a long while, Sophia began to question the lens through which she had been seeing the world, and the people in it. What did she truly know about them? What had she missed? She could still feel the sting of her misstep, but somewhere deep inside, she also realized that this moment was the first step towards something else. A shift, a change, a deeper understanding. And for the first time that night, as she turned away to leave the table, she didn't just see a customer in front of her. She saw a person. The evening had shifted, the lively hum of conversations now a soft murmur, almost drowned out by the quiet clinking of silverware on fine china. The dinner rush was over, and the dining room of Lenoble had taken on a different feel. A stillness that settled in, interrupted only by the occasional low voice of a conversation or the graceful movement of servers. Sophia, having cleared most of the tables, walked with a renewed sense of purpose. She knew the routine. Check on every guest, ensure their experience was flawless. Yet tonight, there was something different in the air. As she glanced at Stephen's table, she noticed something she hadn't before. The way others regarded him. It wasn't just that they were polite. They were respectful. Genuine respect. There was a quiet reverence that seemed to linger around him, even in the way people spoke to him, despite his casual attire. He was a part of the rhythm of the room, not an intrusion. No one was asking for autographs or gawking, they simply acknowledged him and continued on. Yet there was an unspoken understanding. This was someone important. Sophia's pulse quickened as she stood by the kitchen door looking over the room. Her mind raced. She had been so quick to make assumptions, to judge him for something as superficial as his clothes. She had placed him into a box that was comfortable for her. A man who didn't belong in this world of high society. A man out of place, maybe even out of his element. But now, standing back and watching, she felt a twinge of unease. How had she not recognized him earlier? She thought she could tell a lot about people just by looking at them, but this was different. Stephen noticed the change in her gaze, the subtle shift in her posture, the way she was almost tiptoeing around her thoughts. There was an opening now, an opportunity to set things right without making her feel small. He had seen her hesitation, her discomfort, the way she had struggled to mask her judgment. He had known all along, yet had decided to wait. Tonight, the time had come. With a soft sigh, Stephen set his glass down, his fingers gently tapping the rim in thought. When he caught her eye from across the room, he didn't wait for her to approach him. Instead, he called out in a low voice that carried just enough to break the silence between them. "I'm not just another person," he said, his tone steady but firm, yet not cold. His voice held a warmth that made it impossible to mistake. Sophia froze mid-step. Her breath caught, an unfamiliar knot tightening in her chest. She hadn't expected this. She wasn't sure what she'd expected, but certainly not this quiet revelation. Stephen leaned back in his chair, his calm demeanor unwavering. "I'm Stephen Curry. I play for the Golden State Warriors." The world seemed to slow down for a brief moment. Time hung suspended as Sophia's mind struggled to catch up with what she had just heard. The name rang out like a bell. Stephen Curry, the player she had only seen on TV, in articles, and on billboards. Her gaze faltered, her thoughts colliding with one another in a tangled mess. Stephen Curry. The name was iconic. The face was unmistakable. But the man sitting in front of her, dressed casually, sipping his water with a quiet calm, was anything but the image she had built in her head of a sports superstar. Her heart raced as realization flooded over her. The flush in her cheeks deepened, and she felt the heat of embarrassment rise to the surface. All the thoughts she had entertained, the judgments she had passed, seemed like a cruel joke now. Her assumptions, those baseless, hurried conclusions, had been shattered in a single sentence. "I'm sorry. I didn't recognize you," Sophia muttered, her voice barely a whisper. She swallowed, searching for the right words. The apology felt inadequate, too simple. How could she make amends for everything she had assumed about him? "I just assumed—" Her voice trailed off, and she felt a tightness in her throat. "I thought you were just another guy who didn't belong here." But how could she say that out loud? Stephen's expression softened, and the gentleness in his eyes was almost startling. The shift from the casual observer to someone she had wronged was subtle, but undeniable. There was no anger, no judgment in his gaze, just understanding. "It's okay," he said, his smile breaking the tension. "It happens." There was no mockery in his tone, no trace of sarcasm, just an acceptance that disarmed her completely. He didn't need her apology, and she realized in that instant that she hadn't just been seeking to redeem herself for her words, she had been seeking his approval, his forgiveness, even though she hadn't earned it. Stephen's humility was something she had underestimated. Sophia stood there for a moment, caught in the whirlpool of her own emotions, unsure whether to apologize again or let it pass. But something in Stephen's presence told her this wasn't the time for that. This wasn't about her mistakes anymore. It was about something deeper. She nodded slowly, trying to regain her composure. I'll make sure you have a great experience from now on," she managed, her voice steadier than before. There was something in the way he looked at her, so effortlessly kind, that made her believe the world wasn't as simple as she'd once thought. The rules of respect and judgment, rules she had built up over time, were crumbling. Stephen leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table as he regarded her with a calm, open expression. "It's not about the apology, you know," he said, almost as if speaking to himself. "It's about seeing people for who they really are, not just what they seem to be." Stephen's calm demeanor only made Sophia feel more guilty, yet it also made her reflect deeply on her actions. She had been so quick to judge, so quick to assume, that she had lost sight of what truly mattered. "Appearances are one thing," he continued, his voice measured, "but understanding who someone truly is, that's what matters." Sophia stood still, absorbing his words. She had heard phrases like this before, but they never felt so real, so direct. She suddenly realized how wrong she had been. Her view of the world, of the people around her, was limited by her biases. She'd only seen the surface, and Stephen was right. There was so much more beneath that surface to discover. "I didn't mean to judge you," Sophia said softly, her voice genuine now. "I should have known better. I'm sorry." Stephen nodded. "We all make mistakes. The important thing is to learn from them." It was a lesson Sophia didn't know she needed. But now, in this quiet corner of Lenoble, Amidst the subtle clash of cultures and assumptions, she had learned it in the most unexpected way. The man she had judged by his clothes was teaching her something more valuable than anything she had learned in years of waiting tables. And as she walked away, a quiet humility settled within her, a humility she hadn't expected to find that evening. It wasn't just Stephen's fame that mattered, it was his message, his approach to life, and the simple truth that people like him didn't need to be recognized to be important. For the first time that evening, Sophia truly saw him. Sophia went to the back to gather herself, her mind racing with thoughts of how she had treated Stephen. The restaurant seemed quieter, almost surreal, as she reflected on her actions. She had to make things right. When she returned to his table, she approached with humility. "Mr. Curry, I wanted to apologize again. I've never treated anyone like that before, and it was wrong of me. Thank you for being patient with me." Stephen's eyes softened, and he gave her a reassuring smile. "It's okay. We all have room to grow." He finished his meal and prepared to leave, his parting words leaving a lasting impact on Sophia. Respect everyone, regardless of who they are or what they look like. It's the one thing that defines us. The following weeks saw a noticeable change in Sophia's attitude. She was kinder, more attentive, and treated everyone who walked into Lenoble with the same level of respect. Her judgments had softened, and she was no longer quick to make assumptions. It wasn't just about making her customers happy, it was about recognizing their worth as individuals, regardless of their background or appearance. One evening, as she greeted a new guest at the door, she remembered Stephen's words. She didn't need to know anything about their story, just that they deserved her kindness, her respect. And as for Stephen Curry, he likely never realized the profound impact he had on her life, but his words had set a course for her transformation. The ripple effect of his wisdom had extended far beyond Lenoble, inspiring those around him in ways he'd never know. Sophia continued to work at Lenoble, but now with a deep sense of understanding. She treated every customer with the same level of respect, whether they were celebrities or everyday people. Her interactions were no longer based on assumptions, but on empathy and kindness. Stephen's brief visit had taught her a valuable lesson, one that would stay with her for the rest of her life. The restaurant, still as exclusive as ever, had become a place where dignity, respect, and humility were just as important as the fine wine and the meticulously prepared dishes. And though he had left the restaurant quietly that evening, Stephen's influence had stayed with Sophia long after.